When you invest in a government bond, you are essentially giving a loan to the government. Government bonds are available in various durations. There are government bonds of durations as short as 3 months, and then there are government bonds of durations as long as 10 years. When you invest in a 3-month government bond, you're essentially giving a loan to the government for 3 months. And when you're investing in a 10-year government bond, you're essentially giving a loan to the government for 10 years. What difference it makes for you investing between a 3-month bond and a 10-year bond? Well, normally, under normal circumstances, the rate of interest that you can earn by investing in a longer duration government bond, such as a 10-year bond, is usually higher than the rate of interest that you can earn by investing in shorter duration government bonds, such as 3-month government bonds. But this is under normal circumstances. There are also abnormal times, and during such abnormal times, the rate of return on a longer duration government bond, such as the 10-year government bond, falls below the rate of interest on a shorter duration government bond, such as a 3-month government bond. And when this happens, the bond market is said to have gotten into something called yield curve inversion. Why do yield curve inversions matter? Ladies and gentlemen, in the post-Second World War era, the US economy has witnessed recessions 12 times. And guess what? 12 out of 12 times. Each of these recessions have been preceded by yield curve inversions. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, the yield curve has now acquired the reputation of being arguably the most accurate predictor of upcoming recessions in the US. Now, why do recessions in the US matter, you might ask? Well, recessions in the US matter because recessions in the US are usually also accompanied by very large stock market corrections, not just in the US equity markets, but pretty much around the world, including here in India. But why are we talking about yield curve inversions now? We are talking about yield curve inversions now because, like it or not, the yield curve in the US bond market has inverted yet another time. Clearly, it's time to be very, very cautious. Hi, my name is Indranil Guha, and I'm one of the co-founders of MetaCaps.ai, which is an AI-driven personal finance platform. Ladies and gentlemen, we are today going to talk about something called yield curve inversion. I know that sounds very, very technical, but I promise I'm going to break it up for you in very, very simple language. Also in this video, I'm going to help you understand how yield curve inversions have historically been very, very useful in predicting large stock market corrections well in advance. Ladies and gentlemen, before we understand what are yield curve inversions, we need to first understand what are government bonds. Ladies and gentlemen, when you and I have to borrow, we usually go to the bank to take a loan. Like us, the governments also usually have to borrow because taxes that governments impose are usually never enough to cover all their expenses. And there's always a shortfall, and to cover that shortfall, governments have to borrow. But how do governments borrow? Governments usually do not go to a bank to take out a loan. Instead, governments sell what are called government bonds. And anyone who invests in these government bonds is essentially giving a loan to the government. In this video, we are going to specifically talk about the US government bond market. The US government bonds are usually available in a number of durations. There are short-term US government bonds, durations as short as 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and then there are US government bonds of durations as long as 10 years, 20 years, even 30 years. If you invest in a short duration US government bond, such as a 3-month US government bond, you're essentially giving a loan to the US government for a period of 3 months. And if you're investing in a 10-year US government bond, you're essentially giving a loan to the US government for a period of 10 years. And whatever is the duration of the bond, the US government is going to pay you an interest for the entire duration of that bond. Ladies and gentlemen, one thing that we have to keep in mind when it comes to loans, there's always a risk of a default, the risk that you may not be able to get back your money. Imagine a scenario where you lend money to a friend of yours. Like it or not, there is always a risk that your friend may default on this loan and may not be able to return the money to you intentionally or unintentionally. It could be because of a number of reasons. It could be because he may have lost his job. It could be because he may not be in very good health. Now, these reasons because of which he may not be able to return your money, these risks usually keep on increasing with passage of time. The risk that he may lose his job, the risk that he may not be in good health, these risks are usually significantly higher 10 years down the line compared to just 1 year down the line. And that's why it's far riskier giving somebody a loan for 10 years compared to giving the same person a loan for 1 year. And that's why lenders usually insist on a higher rate of interest to compensate for the risk when lenders are lending to someone for a longer duration compared to when they are lending to the same entity or same person for a shorter duration. Now, if you think about it, the entire banking industry, in fact, works on the same principle. What is the business model of banks? Banks usually get in their money from depositors and then they use this money to lend to their customers at a higher rate of interest. But how is it that banks are able to charge a higher rate of interest from their customers compared to the rate of interest that they have to pay to their depositors? It is so because of the difference in duration of the loans involved. When you, as a depositor, you go to a bank to deposit your money by way of a bank FD, these deposits are usually of relatively shorter durations. What is the typical duration of a bank FD? It's 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. And the bank typically pays you in the range of 7.5 to 8% on these bank fixed deposits. And what does the bank do with this money? The bank in turn will take the money from you and lend it away to its own customers. And what is usually the nature of loans that the bank gives out? Usually these are home loans, car loans, business loans. The typical duration of these loans are longer. Home loans, for example, are typically of 10-year, 15-year, even 20-year duration. These are essentially very long duration loans. And that's why the bank is able to charge a higher rate of interest from their customers. So that's how the bank is able to get away by getting the money from depositors and pay them 7 to 8% and then charge maybe around 9 to 10% or even higher on the loans that they give out to you in the form of home loans, car loans, and business loans. Now let's get back to the government bonds. The exact same principle applies to government bonds as well, because as I explained to you, a government bond is nothing but a loan that you give to the government, where the risk of a default keeps on increasing with the duration of the loan. And that's why government bond investors usually insist on a higher rate of interest on longer duration government bonds compared to shorter duration government bonds. Let me illustrate that by giving you some hard data around what kind of rate of return you could have earned by investing in US government bonds of various durations. Now, I'm recording this video on 29th March 2024. For the sake of this illustration, I'm going to first take you back to a date exactly 3 years back, 29th March 2021. Let's see what's the kind of rate of returns that were prevailing in US bond market for US government bonds of various durations. On that day, had you invested in a US government bond of 1 month duration, you could have earned a rate of return of 0.02% per annum. On a 2-month US government bond, 0.03% per annum. On a 3-month US government bond, 0.03% per annum. On a 6-month US government bond, 0.04% per annum. On a 1-year US government bond, 0.06% per annum. 2-year US government bond, 0.14% per annum. On a 3-year US government bond, 0.32% per annum. 5-year US government bond, 0.89% per annum. 7-year US government bond, 1.37% per annum. 10-year US government bond, 1.73% per annum. 20-year US government bond, 2.32% per annum. And finally, on a 30-year US government bond, you could have earned a rate of return of 2.43% per annum. So these are the rate of returns that you could have locked in had you invested in US government bonds of various durations on 29th March 2021. And as we can clearly see, the rate of return on these bonds progressively increase with the duration of these bonds. And if you join these dots, then the line that you get is referred to as the yield curve. Why is it called the yield curve? Because the rate of return that you get that by investing in a bond is also called the yield of the bond. And hence the dots representing the yields of these bonds of various durations. When you join these dots, the line that you get is called the yield curve. Normally, the shape of the yield curve is a line which is pointing towards the upside, as the one that you can see on the screen. Why is it a line which points towards the upside? Because yields on bonds, as I just explained to you, usually increase with the duration of the bonds. But that is not the case at all times. There are also exceptions to the rule. There are also abnormal times when this rule goes for a toss. And to see examples of when this rule goes for a toss, we have to fast forward 3 years. We have to go and take a look at what's happening to US government bond rates as of now. As I said, I'm recording this video on 29th of March 2024. The most recent data that we have is that of yesterday, 28th March 2024. Let's take a look at what were the yields on US government bonds of various durations as of yesterday. Yesterday, had you invested in a 1 month US government bond, you could have got a yield of 5.49% per annum. So clearly, interest rates have shot up significantly over the last 3 years. On a 2-month US government bond, you would have got a rate of return of 5.48% per annum. On 3-month US government bond, 5.46% per annum. 6-month US government bond, 5.38% per annum. 1-year US government bond, 5.03% per annum. 2-year, 4.59% per annum. 3-year, 4.40% per annum. 5-year, 4.21% per annum. 7-year, 4.20% per annum. 10 years, 4.20% per annum. 20 years, 4.45% per annum. And finally, 30-year US government bond would have fetched you a rate of return of 4.34% per annum. Now, as you can see, the shape of the yield curve is very, very different from the shape of the yield curve that prevailed 3 years back. Right now, we have got a yield curve which is pointing towards the downside, and when you get a yield curve that is pointing towards the downside, such a yield curve is called an inverted yield curve. And how do we get an inverted yield curve? We get an inverted yield curve when the yield on a longer duration US government bond drops below the rate of return on yield on a shorter duration US government bond. To check specifically for inversion in the yield curve, the two most important durations that one needs to focus on are 3 months and 10 years. As you can see, right now, the yield on a 3-month US government bond is a staggering 5.46% per annum, whereas the rate of return, the yield on a 10-year US government bond is just 4.2% per annum. It's 1.26 percentage points lower. That's significantly lower than a shorter duration US government bond. So what happens what are the implications of an inverted yield curve? Ladies and gentlemen, let me be upfront. Whenever you get an inverted yield curve, it usually means that bad things are likely to follow, both for the economy as well as for the stock market. Another way to visualize yield curve inversions is to plot the historical yield of 10-year US government bond and compare it with the historical yield of a 3-month US government bill. So what you see on the screen right now is this blue line, which represents the historical yield of a 10-year US government bond over the last 40 years. As you can see, in 1981, the yield on a 10-year US government bond went to a level of more than 15% per annum. In fact, it went to almost 16%. And since then, of course, we have had this dramatic collapse in rates in the US. And 10-year US government bond rates dropped to an all-time low of less than 1% during COVID. Since then, of course, we have had some backup in rates, and at present, the 10-year US government bond yields are hovering at around 4% level. So this is the 10-year US government bond yields historically. Against this, we are going to superimpose the historical yield of a 3-month US government bond yield over the same period. Now, one technical nuance here, when you are talking about a bond whose duration is less than 1 year, then you refer to the bond not as a bond but as a bill. That's why the correct way to refer to a bond of 3 months is a 3-month US government bill. So that's what you see on your screen right now. The yellow line represents the historical yield on a 3-month US government bill over the last 40 years. As you can see, most of the time the blue line is above the yellow line, because we saw in normal circumstances the shape of the yield curve is such that the yield on a longer duration bond is higher than the yield of a shorter duration bond. But that's not the case at all times. There are few occasions when this yellow line does go above the level of the blue line. So 3-month bill rates going above the rates of 10-year government bonds, this basically represents that the yield curve has inverted. If you want to visualize this inversion even more clearly, what you basically need to do is to plot the difference between the blue line and the yellow line, which is exactly what I have done here by way of this red line. This red line is nothing but blue line minus yellow line. This red line basically represents the historical yield on 10-year US government bonds minus the yield on 3-month government bond. So blue minus yellow is what you get yellow. You get the red line. And as I explained, because during most times the blue line is above the yellow line, so blue minus yellow is a positive number, and hence this red line is above zero. This is the zero level. Most of the time this red line is above zero on most occasions, but there are few occasions in history when this yellow line goes above blue line. It went above blue line here, it went above blue line here, it went above blue line here, again here, again here. And whenever this happens, the yield curve is said to have inverted. And this inversion can be very clearly seen in the red chart by way of the red line going below zero, red line going to negative territory. So basically, whenever 10-year bond yields minus 3-month bond yields, the difference becomes negative. That basically means that the yield curve has inverted. And I'm going to highlight the 4 occasions in the last 40 years when this happened. And whenever this happened, this is basically when we got inversion in the yield curve. What is the implication of the yield curve inversion for the wider economy? Ladies and gentlemen, as I mentioned a little while back, whenever the yield curve inverts, usually that has meant that bad things are going to follow for the economy as well as for the stock market. I'm going to come to the stock market in just a while, but let's look at what has been historically been the implication on the economy. As you can see, the vertical pink bars that are visible on the screen right now represent the periods in the last 40 years when the US economy witnessed recessions. And as we can see, there seems to be a very tight correlation between the incidence of a yield curve inversion and the incidence of a recession in the US economy. We got an inversion here, it was followed by a recession. We got an inversion here, it was again followed by a recession. We got an inversion here, it was again followed by a recession. And again, before COVID as well, we had got an inversion, and we yet again got another recession. So there seems to be a very tight relationship. Whenever we have got an inversion, it is usually followed by a recession in the US economy. But at this stage, I also must point out that over the last 40 years, there has also been one instance of a false alarm when the yield curve did invert, but it was not followed by a recession. This happened in 1998. As you can see, it was a very shallow recession. The red line just about touched the zero level and then backed off. It didn't go into negative territory in a very material way, but nonetheless, it was an inversion and it was not followed by a recession. And to that extent, this was a false alarm. This was only the second time in the post-World War II era where the inversion of the yield curve proved to be a false alarm, the first time being in 1966. In fact, it might be interesting to have a look at how many times the yield curve inversion in the post-Second World War era has proved to be a reliable indicator of an upcoming recession in the US, and how many times it has proved to be a false alarm. In the post-Second World War era, we have had 14 inversions in total. How many times out of these 14 inversions the yield curve inversion has proved to be a reliable advance indicator of an upcoming recession in the US? 12 out of 14 times. So overwhelmingly, it has been a reliable indicator. How many times it has proved to be a false alarm? Twice, 2 out of 14 times, in 1966 and then in 1998. So clearly the odds are stacked overwhelmingly in favor of the yield curve inversion to be a reliable leading indicator of an upcoming recession rather than being a false alarm. Of course, the possibility of it being a false alarm is always there. Now, why are we talking about a yield curve inversion at this stage? Well, we are talking about a yield curve inversion at this stage because, as you can see, we have got this massive inversion in the yield curve since 2022. In fact, the scale of the inversion, the extent to which this red line has gone to the negative territory this time round has been the highest in history. The yield curve has never inverted to this extent ever in the post-Second World War era, which only confirms my view that this time round, a yield curve inversion is very likely going to be followed by a recession. Of course, this could also prove to be the third time when the yield curve inversion ends up becoming a false alarm. That possibility is also there, and we definitely should keep that in mind. But if I have to look at the odds in terms of the historical probability, the odds are clearly stacked in favor of this inversion, also proving to be a reliable advance indicator of an upcoming recession, more so because of the extent to which the yield curve has inverted. It has, as you can see, the yield curve has never really inverted so heavily towards in the negative territory ever in history. Now I come to the most important part of this video. What is the impact of an yield curve inversion on equity markets here in India? And this is where I get the strongest pushback to my thesis. A lot of people here in India ask me, so what, we have got a yield curve inversion in the US, and so what if it's going to lead to a recession in the US? That is their problem. How does it matter to us here in India? Well, to all those people who believe that a recession in the US is a problem only for the Americans to deal with, I want to unequivocally tell you that that's a completely wrong presumption. Because if you go by historical precedents, a recession in the US leads to a large stock market drawdown, not just in the US, but a ripple effect of that is felt everywhere around the world, especially in emerging markets like India. In fact, over the last 20 years, the scale of drawdowns in emerging markets following recessions in the US have been far larger than the drawdown in US equity markets itself. And that's why a recession in the US matters to us here in India. Let's look at how has yield curve inversions historically impacted our markets. So this is the yield curve that we saw a while back. The red line represents the difference between 10-year US government bond yields and 3-month US government bill rates. I'm looking at the yield curve only over the last 20-year period, because this is what is relevant for us here in India. This is the period when our markets were exposed to the effects of foreign institutional flows, and that's why this is the most relevant period to look at. During this time, as we can see, we saw two recessions in the US economy, 2008 and 2020. And before both these recessions, the yield curve quite reliably inverted sometime in the run-up to the recession. What was the effect of that on our markets? Anyone who believes that a recession in the US was a problem only for the Americans, well, this is how the Nifty reacted. The blue line is the Nifty-50 index, and as you can see, after the yield curve inverted sometime around 2006 and it was followed by a recession in 2008, we got a 60% correction in the Nifty between January and October of 2008. In fact, as you can see here, the top of the Nifty at the beginning of 2008 almost exactly tied up with the start of the recession in the US. So onset of a recession and the stock market peak in India, they coincided almost exactly. So that's how important, that's the kind of bearing that a recession in the US has on our markets. We can be absolutely certain that if there is a recession in the US and that leads to a large stock market correction in the US, we are going to feel the full brunt of that here in India. The same thing happened once again during COVID. Before COVID, we had this inversion about a year before the onset of COVID, and then we got the recession, which was accompanied by almost a 38% correction in Nifty. So there should be no doubts that if a recession hits the US next time, and there is a large stock market correction, which is almost guaranteed, we will feel the full brunt of that. And why this is especially relevant at this point in time? Because we have got yet another inversion, and it's a fairly large inversion, as I was talking about a little while back. We got an inversion around October of 2022. So the yield curve has now been inverted for over 1.5 years. And the scale of the inversion is what is really scary. As you can see, the red line has gone to a negative. The extent to which the red line has gone to negative territory is a record in itself. The yield curve has never inverted to this extent ever in history. And that's why it's looking increasingly likely that this inversion in the US yield curve is very, very likely going to lead to a recession in the US, and that will have very adverse implications for the stock markets here in India. So what should be our action points with our equity portfolios? Should we sell all our equity holdings and go to a very, very defensive posture? Again, Unequivocal answer is no. And the answer is no because the lead up to a recession and a accompanying stock market crash has two steps. The inversion is only the first step. There is also an important second step, which is called uninversion. And only after the uninversion happens do we get a recession and the accompanying stock market crash. Now, what is this uninversion? Sounds like a very funky term, but let's understand what exactly is uninversion. Inversion, as I explained to you, happens when this red line goes below zero, when the difference between US 10-year bond yields and US 3-year bond yields goes to, the difference becomes negative. US 10-year bond yields goes below the level of US 3-year bond yields. That's when the yield curve inverts. So before 2008, we had got the inversion somewhere around the middle of 2006. This is when the red line went to negative territory for the first time. But so in a way, the start of the inversion of the yield curve set the countdown for the next recession. It almost made it a certainty that we will get a recession in the US at some point in time. But would it have been a good idea to sell all equity holdings once the inversion happened out of a fear that we are going to get a recession at some point in time? Clearly no, because after the inversion, as we can see, we got the most feverish part of the equity rally happened after the inversion. There was the markets almost doubled between middle of 2006 and the market top in around January of 2008. So inversion is clearly not the point where one needs to go to a defensive posture. In fact, if at all you want to consider going towards a defensive posture, is when the yield curve uninverts. Now, what is uninversion? Uninversion basically happens when, as you can see, after the red line goes to negative territory, at some point in time, the red line once again gets back to positive territory. And once it gets back to the positive territory, that's the point where the yield curve is said to have uninverted. And historically, uninversion is almost a prerequisite for the recession to materialize and a stock market correction to materialize. A recession and the stock market correction invariably happens only after the uninversion. So inversion is not what we need to look at. The most important step that we need to look out for is the uninversion to happen. It's only after that should we start considering moving towards a defensive posture. As we can see, after the uninversion happened, did the recession materialize and the stock market correction also materialize. The same thing happened once again before COVID also. We got this inversion about 1 year before the start of the 1 year before the onset of the COVID pandemic. But it was only after the uninversion happened that the final recession actually kicked in sometime after that, and the stock market correction also happened after that. So going by that logic, one need not take defensive action at this stage, because what we have got so far is only an inversion, and the inversion happened long time back in October of 2022. The uninversion process, by the way, has already started. The uninversion starts, the red line first starts to come down. At some point in time, it starts to again go back up again. So the red line has started to going up again, but the red line is still in the negative territories. The red line being in the negative territories means the yield curve is still inverted. The 10-year rates are continue to be below that of 3-year rates. At some point in time, this red line will continue to go up and it will go above zero. At that stage, the yield curve would have uninverted. That's the stage one has to become really, really careful, because after that, it's only a matter of time that a recession materializes and a large stock market correction also follows. So if at all you want to go towards a defensive posture, if at all you want to introduce an element of timing in your equity portfolio, the next stage to look out for has to be the uninversion. One need not start going towards a defensive posture merely based on the yield curve inversion. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings me to the end of this video. I hope I was able to highlight some of the risks and opportunities for us here in India resulting from a yield curve inversion in the US bond market. If I was able to add some value to you during the course of this video, I'll request you to like and share this video. Also, please do consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you very much for watching this video.